In cell-mediated immunity, we're talking about T cells fighting against intracellular microorganisms. Okay? In particular, we are talking about cytotoxic T cells. And in cell-mediated immunity, the result is we get destruction of cells in which the intracellular, so microorganisms that have entered cells, are located. Okay? So here in cell-mediated immunity, let's take a look at what's happening. Okay, here we have a target cell. This is a cell that has been infected with a foreign invader. It is infected with this virus or whatever the microorganism is. It chops up that virus, creates class 1 molecules, and displays the foreign antigen on the surface of its cell. A cytotoxic T cell, which has been activated by a helper T cell. Remember, helper T cells secrete these cytokines. These are chemicals that can activate other cells. The cytotoxic T cell will come and bind to this processed antigen MHC complex, recognize that this is the antigen that it is specific for, and has a secondary stimulation thing of CD8 proteins marking and binding this class 1 molecule. Do you see how this is coming out here? If all of these things are in place, we have interleukin 2 from the helper T cell. We get binding of the antigen that's presented by this MHC class 1 molecule. And we have a CD8 marker coming out and binding to that MHC class 1 molecule. Then we can get activation of the cytotoxic T cell. Further activation, we can get proliferation and clones form. So what happens to these clones, right? So we get activation of a cytotoxic T cell and we get some clones. Some of the clones will remain cytotoxic T cells, some will form memory T cells. The cytotoxic T cells will release chemicals that can enhance inflammation, and they can also kill cells on contact. So the cytotoxic T cell will release a chemical called perforin that pokes a hole in the target cell plasma membrane. The target cell will lyse and it dies. Okay. Now, in the last little bit here, we're going to talk about ways that we acquire adaptive immunity. So we know adaptive immunity is acquired over time. We can get adaptive immunity either by active means or by passive means. In active immunity, you produce your immunity by your own immune system. In passive immunity, you are going to receive immunity from someone else. I always like to make this example that, in active immunity, your immune system's doing the work. In passive immunity, someone else is doing the work of becoming immune and just transferring it to you. One of these is going to stick longer. I bet you can probably guess that this one does. This one creates memory. Let's make a little note of that here, okay? Active immunity creates memory cells because you are producing the immunity. You're working to remember that antigen. Here, passive immunity is very temporary. It provides temporary protection, not lifelong protection, because you don't create immune cells and memory cells. So there's two types of active immunity. You see natural and artificial. In natural active immunity, your immune system is going to be exposed to an antigen through natural exposure, and then you acquire immunity as a result of that. So like you walk through a sneeze cloud and now you have a cold, and you're going to have immunity in the future against that particular cold virus, okay? In artificial active immunity, this is what vaccinations are all about, that you artificially or purposefully, deliberately introduce an antigen to your body to stimulate an immune response. And so you have memory cells that will remember that pathogen if it does enter the body naturally in the future. For passive immunity, for natural passive immunity, this occurs via breast milk, and it occurs when a mother passes antibodies across the placenta. So the mother in both of these situations is producing the antibodies and passing them to her child. This is not long-term immunity, it's temporary immunity, because those antibodies are proteins, and they will survive for a short period of time in the baby's bloodstream, but not forever. Okay, so you're passing antibodies from one individual to another. An artificial passive immunity, in this situation, typically you'll see antibodies that are produced by an animal or another human be given via injection to another individual. So this is not super common, but antivenom is an example where this might occur, where if someone gets bit by a snake, okay, they may receive antibodies that another animal has produced against that venom, and so it provides temporary protection against that venom. In this situation, in both of these situations, the person receiving the antibodies does not create memory, they don't create memory cells, so it is not long-term immunity. Okay, this is an overview of all the immune interactions. So I know this is pretty small. You can see this in your textbook, though. This is from your textbook. It shows innate immunity. This is a general response that does not improve with subsequent exposure. We talked about all these innate immune things that are in your body. Okay. Then we have adaptive immunity. Usually starts with a helper T cell being activated and presented with an antigen by a macrophage. Helper T cells can activate B cells that will then create plasma cells and memory B cells. Plasma cells will make antibodies. Helper T cells can activate cytotoxic T cells. Cytotoxic T cells can also differentiate into memory T cells and then just active effector cells that will fight the current infection. Cytotoxic T cells can kill cells that have an antigen inside of them, or they can release chemicals that will enhance the inflammatory process. Remember that antibodies don't directly kill any antigen, but they can render it useless and ineffective, and it can also clump them together. Okay, here is a really great summary of innate and adaptive immune responses, what cells are functioning here, and what kinds of things are occurring in these different processes. And then finally, this last table is just really kind of, I don't want you to try to read it here. You'd have to blow it up and look at it a little closer or look at it from your textbook. But there are all sorts of conditions that you might want to refer to, conditions of the lymphatic system and conditions of the immune system. Here's a little bit of information about allergies. They're also known as hypersensitivities. There are different types of hypersensitivities, so you could take a look at those as well.